Hello and good morning, everyone. Hello. I can see everyone kind of filtering in. Hi, I'm Lucy. We've got two Lucys on the call today, so nice and easy to remember everyone's names. I'm COO here at Strive, and it's so wonderful to have so many of you here with us today. And for what I know is going to be a really kind of meaningful and important conversation. Thank you for joining us to talk about something that really touches every single one of us, yet is rarely spoken openly at work. That's bereavement, grief, and how we show up for people in some of life's hardest moments. While we're waiting for a few more people to join, please do say hi in the chat. Let us know your name, the organisation you're tuning in from, and what's brought you here today. And don't forget to set your chat to everyone as well so we can all connect. I do know that's something, it's a little bit of a quirk in Zoom. There's a little drop down you'll notice in the little typing box just to do that. Throughout the session, we really want this to feel like a real conversation, a place for you to network and meet folk in similar organisations or with similar challenges. So do make the most of the group we've got here today. It's a really vibrant group with lots of different people and some really interesting folk that I know you can all connect with. The Q&A feature at the bottom is your space to submit questions for our guest. Please do get them in early. We've got a really good chunk of time at the end of the session to go through them, but we do know it will be a popular one. So if you see a question you'd love answered, do give it an upvote and we'll be prioritising the most popular ones. We've also had a few submitted before the webinar as well that we'll try and pick up. And for anyone joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome. As a quick introduction to us, Strive is employee engagement survey software built to help organisations create really meaningful surveys that actually reach everyone, including those without a company email address. So you get the honest, representative responses you need to take real action and provide real support for your colleagues. We work with some really brilliant organisations. London Zoo, UK Space Agency, and Newcastle United are among some of them. And we're always happy to chat. So please do get in touch after today if you'd like to know more about how we can work with you. So to help with the connection between you all today, and just to help see where you're at in the journey, we've got a poll or two we'll be running. I'm just popping the first one live now. So it would be really great just to kind of get a state of play for kind of how confident does your organisation feel supporting bereaved colleagues right now, and then where you're kind of at in that employee wellbeing journey as well. So if you could all just pop in and answer, that'd be amazing. And now to today's session. This webinar has drawn incredible interest and it tells us something really important, that people managers and HR professionals are ready to have this conversation and do more for their people. I'm so pleased to introduce our guest for today, Lucy Carpenter. She leads on the Compassionate Employers Programme at Hospice UK, a programme that's reached over 165,000 employees across UK workplaces, supporting organisations to better care for people experiencing grief, caring responsibilities, or a life-changing diagnosis. As a facilitator, trainer, and advisor, Lucy works with organisations like yours every day on some of the most human and overlooked challenges in working life. That's death, dying, and grief. And she brings real expertise, real warmth, and a real practicality to it all. I heard Lucy speak, I don't even think it's 6 months ago. Yeah, and we just knew we had to get her on for this webinar series. So we're genuinely lucky to have her with us today. Please do, like I say, make the most of the chat as we're going through and make sure you get your questions in if you do have any nice and early, just to make sure we can get to the ones that everyone is really looking to have her. So Lucy, I will hand over to you. The floor is yours for the presentation.
That was such a nice welcome,
Oh,
and expectations set high, so appreciate it. But yeah, hi everyone. My name is Lucy Carpenter, and I lead the Compassionate Employers Programme here at Hospice UK. Just to give you an overview of Hospice UK as an organisation, we are a national membership organisation, so we support and connect over 200 hospices across the UK. You might have connections to your local hospices. Generally, they're community independent based charities. And what we do is we work on a national level to bring their voices together to make sure that the sector is really well represented. We campaign, do a lot of political campaigning, we do fundraising, and essentially we are here to help ensure each and every one of those hospices can continue to deliver the care that they do to their communities, for all who need it now and forever. I was really thrilled to join the organisation nearly 2 years ago now. I'm incredibly passionate about this area of work, and I'm hoping that will come across massively as Lucy and Jade invited me along to come along and do this session today. It's a really great opportunity for us to have really honest conversations about topics that we're quite nervous about. So Lucy really gave us a great introduction there, but essentially what we do is we work with organisations to meet them where they are in terms of the requirements that they need to support their employees through diagnosis, through caring responsibilities, and through bereavement as well. So today we'll be heavily focusing on the conversation about grief and touching on a bit around caring responsibilities as well. But ultimately, we are aiming to work towards a world where employers feel the need to advocate for people through those moments, but also feel really well prepared to support people in those moments around as well. Our programme is built around kind of three key pillars, and that is greater visibility. So that's all about kind of normalising the conversations about things that we are not very good at talking about as a society. It's about education, which means, delivering that comprehensive education, training and support for line managers, for HR colleagues, in terms of being able to give the best care possible through these really vulnerable moments in life. But it's also about connection. In society, we have moved so far from our traditional sense of connection to the outside world. Many of us don't live along the road from our best friends or our families anymore. And actually more and more of our workforce are looking for that connection and that support from line managers, from colleagues. And so really this is an opportunity for us to have these really honest and vulnerable conversations at work and have that opportunity for people to come together and support each other in those moments. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit, I think it's quite helpful to recognise that there's a huge percentage of people who are of working age who will experience a bereavement every year. So around 24% of the population, of the working population, will experience bereavement every year. So roughly 1 in 4 people in your team might be, or in your organisation, might be impacted every year through bereavement. It's really important also to know that actually a lot of people would consider leaving their employer if they didn't feel adequately supported through this. And we'll talk a little bit about what kind of adequate support might look like, because it will look different for everyone. But 56% of people would say that they would consider leaving their employer, which obviously is a huge cost to businesses in terms of that staff retention. We are going to touch a little bit on carers, and that's largely because we have a huge growing population of carers in the workforce. So every day in the UK, just over or approximately 600 people leave full-time employment to care for a relative or a loved one. And I just want to shine a little light on sandwich carers. For those of you who've never heard of the term sandwich carers, those are, it's kind of defined as the people who possibly have caring responsibilities for both older relatives or older family members and for younger dependents. Now, we're seeing a huge increase in sandwich carers in the workforce, and that's largely because we've kind of got this perfect storm at the moment. We've got an ageing population. We've got people working for longer because of the cost of living crisis. We've got health and social care, which is under a massive strain, which means that families are taking on the responsibility of care in a much more labour intensive way. But we also have people having children later in life, which means that they're much more likely to be balancing both their careers alongside those caring responsibilities. I'm going to start with a bit of a trigger warning. Obviously, you've joined today, you'll be well aware of the fact that we're going to be talking about grief. And I'm not immune to knowing that there will be people on this call who are here because you have personally been impacted by a bereavement, but there might also be people on this call, hopefully, that are here because you want to do better. The main thing to kind of just note at the beginning of this is that there might be things that I talk about which feel triggering, which feel upsetting. Please do feel, if you can, like stick around for it, stick around and know that this is a safe space for any of those emotions to come up. We will have time for those reflections and questions at the end. But also, if you woke up this morning and you had all good intention of being here, but it's just not the right day for it, this is a recorded session, so feel free to come back when it feels, most appropriate for you. So just to get started, we're going to run through some key terminology. So bereavement is the experience of somebody important to us dying. grief is that emotional reaction to loss, whether that's through a death or through a living loss. Disenfranchised grief, one that maybe most of us have probably experienced, but quite often misunderstood, ones that possibly we don't talk about as much, normally also quite frequently invalidated by the kind of social norms. But disenfranchised grief can include a whole host of things. So some examples might be, the breakdown of a relationship, divorce. It might be fertility issues, or, grieving the life that you thought you would have by now. It can also come down to things like redundancies and job loss, that loss of identity through something which once kind of made up who we were. Anticipatory grief refers to the feelings of grief or loss that we might experience before somebody dies. So quite often we see this with carers, but we also see this with people who are possibly living with life-limiting or terminal diagnosis. So often we see this in families who have possibly caring responsibilities for people with Alzheimer's or dementia. Quite often we talk about that kind of losing that person over and over, or losing little parts of that person that made them once who they were. So we see a lot of anticipatory grief as well in those carers communities. And just to define what a carer is, and the reason I include this is because the majority of carers, or a large proportion of carers, don't identify themselves as a carer until approximately 2 years after they've been doing the caring role. Now, that is quite often because most of us will turn to our family and go, it's my responsibility to look after my mum or my dad or my siblings or my children. I'm not a carer because that's just what my role is. But actually, a carer is anyone who looks after or gives help or support to anyone because they have a long-term physical or mental health condition, an illness, or additional needs. So just really important to highlight that right from the beginning. Now, when we talk about grief, we obviously talk about it in a whole host of different ways. And what I would be really grateful for you to do is just throughout today's session, be thinking about not just how this applies in terms of bereavement and supporting people through grief following a bereavement, but also in a whole host of different scenarios. We know during people's working lives, they are going to go through a huge amount of change in their lives. And often that will come with some associated grief. So that could be the death of a pet, it could be a relationship breakdown or divorce, could be being diagnosed with illness, or of course the death of a loved one, but it could also be job changes, redundancies, caring for loved ones, fertility issues, baby loss, miscarriage. So a number of things that can come up whilst we're thinking about grief and the ways that it can impact people. It's good to be mindful of all the different ways as a manager, as an organisation, you might be supporting people through different vulnerable moments in their lives. So I am going to ask you guys to get involved with this bit. This is a great opportunity for us to have a think about what grief looks like. So when you see these words on the screen, I'd love to know, what does grief look like to you? Maybe it's the way that it's shown up in yourself, or maybe it's showed up in the people around you. What kind of emotional impacts or side effects of grief might you be expecting to see? What kind of physical side effects do you recognise or you might be able to see? What behaviours or cognitive impact could you see in the people around you, or indeed in yourself? And also spiritual as well. So if you don't mind getting involved in the comments, it'd be great to hear some feedback on sort of what, how you've recognised grief previously. Overwhelmed, absolutely. Brain fog, exhaustion, becoming quiet, withdrawn, detached. Shutting down, absolutely. Yeah, withdrawal. Sudden unexplained tearful episodes, absolutely. Just feeling done. I think that's a really, it's a very, very common one. Feeling numb, feeling lost. Anger, yeah, loss of faith. Avoidance, absolutely. Yeah, the inability to carry on, not knowing how to navigate. Absolutely. Some really great suggestions there and reflections. Emotionally, we might see sadness, we might see anger, we might see anger at the world, we might see anger at that person. Sometimes we'll see fear and anxiety, that kind of who's going to die next, that question of our own mortality sometimes. Shock can be a really big part of it. So even if a death isn't sudden, the finality of a death can feel very, very sudden. That recognizing just how final death is, and recognizing that actually that real distance between that person can feel really, really shocking. That numbness, that total overwhelm that can send us into total survival mode, especially in those early weeks, those early months, as we're just trying to power on through. Absolutely. Additionally, I do think it's really important to recognize the fact that some people do feel a sense of acceptance or relief. It's often not spoken about as commonly because it's something that we can feel really guilty for. But lots of people who are possibly living alongside anticipatory grief, who's maybe been caring for somebody for a long time or watching somebody deteriorate, can actually feel a real sense of relief when that person is at rest, knowing that they don't have to worry about what the end of that person's life might look like. And that can come with some really, really complicated emotions, especially around guilt. In terms of the cognitive impact, we speak about the decreased ability to concentrate, that brain fog that people have just said, that difficulty in decision making, the forgetfulness. We often, work with people who, for a long time after grief, feel really frustrated by the impact of those cognitive effects. That being able to perform the way that we used to at work or function even as normal day to day can now feel really complicated and exhausting, and we feel a bit of that kind of imposter syndrome coming across. In terms of the behaviours, when we look for behaviours, we might see people being really withdrawn from social interaction, from the people in their teams, from the people in their families. We might see that irritability, that short fuse within families. That might feel like we're walking on eggshells. Within workplaces, within our teams, that might also feel like we're working on eggshells. Somebody who once seemed very kind of content and level-headed might seem hypersensitive and reactive. And that can be really difficult as we kind of coach people and support people following a bereavement. Physically, we often shy away from talking about those physical side effects, but I don't think I've ever spoken to one person who hasn't experienced at least one physical side effect from grief. And that might be sleep disturbances, it might be weight loss, weight gain, aches, pains, IBS, headaches, or indeed just being so physically run down that we end up poorly and burnt out. And spiritually, I know somebody did put in the comments, it can possibly make us question our faith. And it is really important to recognize this, especially in the workplace, is that it can kind of go one of two ways. People might completely withdraw from their faith. They might question their faith and be really struggling with that identity, questioning why this has happened to them or their loved one. Or indeed, people can sometimes really heavily lean into their faith. So you might have people in your teams who maybe weren't practicing actively at work, but now need that time and that protected space to be able to lean into their faith. The main reason we do this activity right from the top is to really recognize that grief doesn't look the same for two people. It's completely different for everyone. And quite often it's completely different each time we experience it. You might process the death of a grandparent completely different to the death of a sibling or a parent. So it's really important to know that we need to continuously check in with people. And we're going to talk in a little bit more about that now. So I don't like to lean too heavily into grief models, but I do think this one is particularly helpful, especially in the workplace. So this model is a dual process model of grief, and it helps us identify how people quite often move between loss and restoration. So sometimes some of you might know of the 5 stages of grief. We've kind of historically moved away from that model because it would suggest that people were kind of able to tick the boxes, go through the stages, and it was all very linear, and then we'd be okay. But actually, this is a much more accurate model in terms of processing grief and living alongside grief. So during our loss days, we might lean really heavily into our grief. We might sit in that sadness and focus on the life that we had before our loved one died. So I often refer to these days as the duvet days, the days where our limbs feel so heavy that we can barely peel ourselves off the sofa or out of bed. Whereas during restoration days, we may lean more heavily into creating our new identity, forming new relationships, figuring out who we are now that that person is no longer in our lives. I think this model's particularly helpful for managers because you'll quite often be supporting people as they oscillate between these two states, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. Many of us will live between these two states for the rest of our lives as we navigate grief. But in the loss coping stage, what we might see is an employee finding it really hard to concentrate on tasks, maybe falling behind on their objectives, maybe seeming withdrawn during meetings, maybe struggling to socialize with their colleagues. But that same colleague a few days later may come into work and seem really focused. They might seem really engaged. They might seem like they're really leaning into project work. And what's just really important for us to recognize is that grief isn't linear. There's not an end line that we're expecting people to get to. It's about being prepared in each of those moments, both in loss and restoration, on how to support those people as they bounce back and forth, as they navigate that new normal for them. As I mentioned, sometimes that's weeks, sometimes that's months, sometimes that's years. We often make the mistake of seeing people in that restoration phase and we go, do you know what? They're coping really well. So I think, they're good now and, they're moving on with life. But actually, there's no finish line. And what is important to note is that we might see people more heavily in those loss stages or that loss space when, anniversaries come up, maybe Christmas, or particularly difficult times of the year for them. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can kind of help identify those key moments where you might be needing to support them a little bit more. I think communication is one of those things that comes up. I think when people reach out to us, it's almost always the first thing that people say is, well, I don't know what to say. And it's really common to not know what to say. And it's really, really normal to feel nervous about these situations. We are not a society that's very good about talking about death and dying. And many of us will have heard really unhelpful phrases. Some of them you might recognize on the screen now. I know exactly how you feel. They lived a long time. At least they didn't die young. You'll get through it. Just be strong. I guess it was their time to go. Everything happens for a reason. They're in a better place. Now, all of these might be well-meaning phrases, and we quite often give the benefit of the doubt when people are saying these things because they're just trying to say something to comfort us. But what is really important to note is that this can feel really diminishing of somebody's experience, where we're trying to create that space for vulnerability, for honesty, for honest conversation. It can immediately close the doors and put those barriers in the way. So it's really important to think about that when we're thinking about the right words. And one of the reasons I can't give you a list of all of the right words to say is that because it's going to be different for everyone. But some of the things that you might think about saying, some of the things that might be more helpful, I can't imagine what you're going through. I'm so sorry for your loss. If you're comfortable to share, I'd love to hear more about them. I've never met anybody who doesn't want to talk about their loved one or have that space to share. I don't know what to say, but I just want you to know that I'm here to listen. I'm here to help you. Whenever you want to talk, just now on the phone call, I'm a Teams away. I think in the workplace as well, anything practical that we can do. I know that the next few months might be tricky for you. Is there practical things that I can do to support you? Taking workload off, having more regular check-ins. So it's really like asking people about those practical support systems. I'm going to talk to you about mirroring language because that is one of my top tips. If you're worried about what to say to somebody, the easiest thing to do is to listen to the words that they're using. So when we talk about mirroring language, we say things like, if somebody comes to you and they say, I've lost my dad, I'm heartbroken because I've lost my dad, then it's very likely they're using the word lost because they don't like the word died. So responding to them and saying, I'm really sorry that your dad died might sound really harsh to them. So one of the best things that we can do to understand the language that's best for the people who are coming to us is to listen to them, to really actively listen to the words they're using and try to mirror that language wherever possible. Are they sharing lots of detail about that person? Can we use their name? Can we think about how to personalize that conversation so we're really actively showing up? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now through our key principles of compassionate conversation. So we designed these a couple of years ago. And it's there to kind of help you feel a bit more grounded just before you go into these conversations. Quite often, it's very, very difficult. We move from one thing to the next in the workplace. So it can be quite difficult to actually sit and reflect on conversation before you go into it and reflect on how it might make us feel. So the first one is listen attentively. Now, we're not a great society of listeners. It's one of the things that we've been trying to learn more and more. A lot of us unlearned it over the last probably 10, 15 years. But paying undivided attention, being present in that conversation, not just listening to respond. If you're in a work setting, minimizing those distractions. How can you turn off your do not disturb, find private rooms, maybe go for a walk, finding space where you can really show up attentively and listen actively is really, really important. Responding mindfully. So thinking about what you're hearing before you respond. Consider the words they're using so you can be really mindful of the language that you're using. This is really helpful. The second step is really helpful when we're thinking about that mirroring language. It's really, really important. Being observant, both of your body language and of the person who's coming to you. What kind of mood, what kind of attitude, what kind of body language is showing up? Trying to remain neutral, trying to remain calm, trying to remain in an open stance. But often when we feel vulnerable in a conversation, we'll be quite fidgety, and that can make somebody feel like we're making them uncomfortable, or indeed that we have somewhere else that we want to be. So that can really shut down the opportunity for a really honest and vulnerable conversation to happen. Managing silence, one that I'm particularly bad at. I hate silence. I'm the first person to try and fill it, but trying to sit in the silence. I think, it's really important to note that sometimes people are not coming to you for the words or for the answers. They just want you to sit with them in that silence and to hear them. And that can be really uncomfortable. So practicing that is really, really important. Respecting emotions. So recognize, we've just seen how many different ways grief can show up for people. Acknowledge all of the emotions that's coming up for that person. Try not to deny the ones that maybe you don't relate to. Try to remain neutral. It's just really important to recognize that grief is going to show up differently for everyone. And each of your team members will be different in the needs that they have. Consider other perspectives, which kind of ties into that last point. Welcome those other experiences, learn from them. Don't be afraid of leaning into these conversations without all of the answers. I think that's a really, really important thing, is that we put barriers in the way of having these conversations because we're scared of not getting it 100% right all of the time. And I'm going to shatter that glass and say, you're never going to get it right 100% of the time, because it's going to be different for every person that you support through these situations. So showing up for that person really authentically and leaning into that learning is really important. I'm going to just mention sharing personal experiences, because this is very, very different depending on who you're supporting. For some people, they find it really helpful to hear that you maybe have similar lived experience, and that can be really supportive for them. For others, they might find that you're trying to diminish their experiences by sharing your own. So the best way to do this, I find, is by saying, I really resonate with some of the things that you're saying. I really resonate with some of the stories that you're sharing. That gives you the opportunity for them to say, really? Like, I would love to hear more. Like, how did you cope? What was the situation that you were navigating? And then you have that mutual ground where it's okay to share. When we think about creating safety in the workplace, I'm going to talk about psychological safety. Now, some of you will hopefully be aware of this term. It's very, very popular at the moment. We're talking a lot more about it because it's really important. And psychological safety is that confidence to take appropriate risks at work built on the quality of our relationships, especially with our line managers, but also with our colleagues. So in psychologically safe environments, we might be less defensive, we might be more focused on achieving team goals, but we were also able to show up with new ideas, or indeed show up and make mistakes. And why we talk about this is because if anybody on this call has navigated grief, we've already heard that fear of making mistakes, that brain fog, the very real side effect of actually not being able to function the same way that we did previously. It's really important to create that psychological safety within teams where people feel like they can return to work in whatever capacity they're capable of, even when life has changed forever for them. And psychological safety is a much, much bigger part of well-being culture generally now. But what's really important to think about is that if we have teams that feel safe to come back following something that's life-changing, then it's going to be much easier to support them. Business-wise, it's much more effective to be able to coach somebody back into work when they feel like they can return at a pace which feels acceptable and supportive for them. So it's really important to be thinking about psychological safety when you're thinking about developing new bereavement or carers practice. It's about having that safe space for people to bring their full selves to work. When we return to work, it can be really, really challenging. We've spoken about that brain fog. We've spoken about the impact cognitively. We've worked with people from all different ranges of seniority. And, we've worked with people who are line managers who are really struggling to then support their team because they can't show up effectively. People worrying with their identity. If we know that we've always been able to perform really high, but actually now we're really struggling with that, that can really challenge us. But also a lot of people really struggle with their identity generally when somebody dies, because it completely alters who you are. If you lose a parent, you're suddenly somebody who doesn't have a mum or a dad. Even just navigating those things can be incredibly challenging. Those emotions, somebody mentioned earlier on, kind of that wave of grief that can just come over you, whether you're on a call and something just triggers you, or indeed an emotion or a thought just comes to your mind and suddenly you're overwhelmed with emotion. We have to be mindful of the fact that these sorts of things will be coming up for people all the time. There are a lot of people who like to return to work for the sense of normality, for the routine. When grief happens, quite often the whole of our world kind of implodes. And so workplaces can be a real welcome distraction for some people. And for some people, that's just not the case. A lot of people can struggle with anxiety. How are people going to approach me now? How are people going to talk to me about this? Are they going to ignore it completely? And I just want to mention the fact that if you haven't had to do the death admin side of things, we call it SADMIN, it's a huge task, and it can go on for months and months, sometimes years, whilst you're sorting out closing down accounts, sorting out probate, clearing houses, and all of those things have to happen alongside people's working lives. So really recognizing the full scope of what somebody is going through is really, really important. I wanted to just share this model. Some of you may well be aware of this model. This is the Growing Around Grief model. I think it's really important to recognize this model, because quite often it's one of those ones that people really resonate with. So Tonkin came up with this model after speaking to a client about the death of a child. The woman told Tonkin that at first, when the child died, that grief filled every part of her life. She drew this picture and circled in all of the shading to show that the grief was all consuming. And what she thought was that over time, that grief would shrink, it would become a much smaller part of her life. But actually what happened was quite significantly different. That grief stayed the same size, still consumed that piece of her life. But what happened was her life was able to grow around it. So it's really important with this model to know that many of us will live alongside our grief for the rest of our lives. And the capacity piece is the bit that we really need to be thinking about. How can we support somebody build that capacity so that they can live alongside their grief and function day to day? And what's really important to note is that sometimes that grief felt just as intense as those first days. And that can be around key dates, especially for people, whether that's birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas, lots of different times in the year that might feel really triggering for people, where they might feel right back into that real intense loss stage where that grief feels all consuming. And it's about knowing how to show up for people in those moments. I'm going to talk very briefly about legal ramifications, and there's a few reasons for this. One of them is that the bereavement leave laws are going to be changing relatively soon, but wanted to just highlight from a carer's perspective, carers' rights at work. And one of the reasons I want to highlight this is if there are carers on the call, it's good to know what your rights are, but also as an organisation, hopefully you're well aware of the things that you need to have in place. So carers are entitled to 1 week unpaid leave per year for caring responsibilities as an organisation. If you can afford to make this paid leave, is massively helpful. We know that carers are some of the most financially vulnerable in society. Carers also have a protection around the right to take reasonable time off for unexpected emergencies, which involve caring for dependents. They also have the right to request flexible working arrangements, which includes reduced hours, home working, or change of job roles. And they are also protected from discrimination. So really important to be aware of those things if you yourself are a carer, or indeed are an organisation trying to become a bit more carer friendly. And I just want to mention the changes to bereavement leave. So at the moment, as it stands, Jack's Law, or parental bereavement leave, is the only legal entitlement for bereavement leave that people have. That is 2 weeks paid leave if a child dies. So that is a child that is past 24 weeks of pregnancy or under the age of 18. And what is currently going through in the new Employment Rights Bill is a new statutory right for at least 1 week of unpaid leave for all employees following the death of a loved one, which includes baby loss and pregnancy loss before 24 weeks. Now, we don't know all of the regulation around this. We don't know what the exact guidance is. We've been trying to support in terms of the consultation on what that might look like. There were certain things that, who does this apply to? Who is within that kind of that bracket of bereavement leave? Does this include siblings and grandparents in the same way that it might include cousins or aunties? Those sorts of things are still being ironed out, and we expect to see that in the next couple of months. And once it is announced, we'll have full guidance that we'll be sharing a full resource pack in terms of how you can embed that into your new policies, as you will need to have internal bereavement leave or compassionate leave policies in place. But I think, one of the questions actually in the pre-Q&A was, what can you do if you're a small organization and you can't afford to just give kind of unlimited bereavement leave? And I'm here to tell you that there's loads that you can do because policies are one thing, they are foundations, but culture and support around that person is so much greater. So if you can afford to enhance paid leave, amazing. If you can't, thinking about defining, expanding the definition of close relatives. We are in 2026, nearly forgot the year that we're in then. Our families, the people who are important to us, the people who we will grieve will be different for everyone. And it's really important to note that some people might not have a relationship with their mum, but their best friend's mum is their maternal figure. And so if they die, what kind of support can we have? I mean, a lot of this is built on trust. It's about building that psychological safety. It's about knowing the people in our teams so that we can trust them when they tell us that they need support for bereavement leave. Building guidance and training for line managers. Obviously, I'm going to bang that drum and scream from the rooftops because managers have such a crucial role to play in terms of really showing up for somebody in that immediate aftermath from a bereavement. So policies are great to have in place, but if the policy says, which many of them do, you can have 3 days or additional leave can be granted at discretion of your manager. Do your managers know what that discretion means? Do they feel confident in their roles to be able to apply that discretion? Or are you going to have this inconsistency across your organization in terms of how people apply that support? Do you have somebody in one team who gets 4 weeks off following the death of her father and the other one has 4 days off? Where's the balance? And there is a real disparity across a lot of organizations in terms of how managers show up in those moments. I am also a massive advocate for internal networks. So I know how important internal networks are. There is a growing population of internal networks, whether it's carers networks, multi-faith networks, bereavement networks, fertility networks, a huge collection of networks are now blossoming across workforces in the UK. And it's a wonderful opportunity for connection and that peer support in the workplace. Speak to them. If you're reviewing guidance, if you're reviewing your policies, talk to those networks, gather that lived experience, get their insight, because as soon as you speak to those people who've been through these scenarios, who have got that lived experience, your policies immediately become foundationally more strong, but also much more applicable for real life application. And also see it as your responsibility. I'm a really big believer that workplaces have a real responsibility to look after their workforce, but also play a real crucial role in normalising the conversation about grief, around caring, around diagnosis. I see it as a huge opportunity for workforces to really step up and say, I know that you're going to navigate, many of our workforce will navigate this during their working lives. And we have a responsibility because not everybody has access to the same education in society to be able to educate people on this topic and be able to create a space for this education. So really, really important to see it as our responsibility. We all have a role to play, whether you're a manager, whether you're a colleague, all of this is applicable to your colleagues, to your friends, to your family. If you feel better equipped to support the people around you, the effect and the ripple effect can be massive. Hopefully you're all aware that I am very passionate about this topic, and there's a few reasons for that, but the main one is my dad. So I was a carer for my dad for the best part of 4 years. He was diagnosed with esophageal cancer when I was 21, and he died in 2020, so nearly 6 years ago, when I was 24, 25. And it was impossibly difficult to navigate. It was a total loss of identity for me. I struggled massively in terms of this imposter syndrome, this kind of sense of who am I now? What am I doing with my life? I'd committed so much time to kind of being there to supporting him through his diagnosis and through his treatment. And I had not identified myself as a carer at all until he died. It wasn't until the absence of that caring role was there that I realized how much of my life had just been dedicated to looking after him. I'd been taking these kind of odd jobs, dog walking, cleaning, nannying, to try and fit around his chemo and his radio and various other kind of medical appointments that we were attending over those years. And when he died, I had this real sense of what am I going to do now? And so I became incredibly passionate around this work, became a real advocate for having these conversations, for being better at these conversations. We didn't do any conversations with Dad about dying before he died, and it was a real disservice to him because we didn't have anything planned. So I'm a real big advocate for planning ahead, for having these really honest conversations, for building the education in society, in our workforces, in our friends, in our family, because it's really, really important that we're more prepared for this. We're all going to navigate it at some point. And I'm going to share with you a resource that I created just after he died. And it was because I was returning to work and I felt really lost in terms of how to communicate with my managers. I knew that I was early career and I was going to change roles in the next few years, and I have done. And each time I wanted to have something which explained my life, but without, so that my managers could show up and support me in the moments that I really needed them. So I created this Get to Know Me document, and I was really fortunate last year that I was able to format this officially, kind of as a document that we could share. We've had over 500 organisations download this resource and start to embed it in their teams, and it's a really, really helpful tool, both for employees and for line managers, often used by HR during an onboarding process as well. And within this document, it asks some really key things. So it asks people to identify, or to share what they're happy with sharing about their life outside of work. So, alongside saying I leave work at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday to pick up my daughter from nursery, I can identify that I take my dad to chemo on a Thursday. I might not have identified myself as a carer, but you may well, as my manager, be able to say, oh, by the way, did you know that we have special protections in place for people with caring responsibilities like this? It's also got really important dates for me. So, I know that I still struggle around Dad's anniversary. So highlighting that to my manager, making sure that she's aware, so that they can show up for me in those moments, knowing that actually I might need a bit of additional support during that time is really important. I'm incredibly high functioning, and sometimes it's quite difficult to know if I'm struggling. But what that might look like is I might be skipping my lunches, I might be working late, I might not be taking effective break or annual leave. And so being able to identify that and say to my manager, these are the ways that I might be struggling, will mean that she'll be able to see the difference between me being super productive and me actually burning myself out, and ways that I'd like her to support me in those moments. So actually, like, the way that I need somebody to support me is probably just to call me out on it and say, look, I feel like you're really taking a lot on at the moment. Is everything okay? It's a classic kind of avoidance thing for a lot of people. Additionally, we wanted this resource to be about that bigger relationship with our people. So it's really about building a full and better picture of who we have in our teams, because that helps us show up much more effectively for them. So it includes some of those performance things about feedback, around any kind of accommodations that they have around flexible working. So we'll share a link to this so that you can download it after today. But it's a really, really helpful tool, and we've heard some great things about it for lots of different people using it, both as somebody who has been bereaved and as managers who are just trying to build that psychological safety with their teams. My top recommendation is, if you are a manager and you're thinking about introducing this to your team, then fill it out first. There's a real sense of vulnerability that they might need to see from you before they feel safe to be vulnerable too. And that can feel a little bit scary. And I would highlight, or I would recommend listening to Brené Brown's TED Talk on shame and vulnerability, because that's a really great way to kind of think about how vulnerability shows up for us as leaders and actually how that might come across in our leadership styles. So would definitely recommend having a look at this document, seeing maybe how you can adapt it to your workplace or to your teams. I like this quote to kind of end on because I think it's so true. We all face a choice in life to be the light in the corner of a dark room or to add to the darkness. People might forget your words, but they'll never forget how your light made them feel, how you showed up for them when they felt really vulnerable, and how you offered support when they needed it most. So my big takeaway for all of you, regardless of kind of who you are, what your background is, what organization you are in, or what kind of level of seniority you're in, we all have a role to play in making sure this conversation is on the table to make sure that there's a space for vulnerability and space for that advocacy piece of work within our workplaces. I've got a couple of signposting organizations. I'm not going to talk through them too much. No, actually, I am. At a Loss is a great signposting organisation. So if you want to find local resource in terms of planning for having conversations about end of life, or indeed following a bereavement, really great space to go and find support. Widowed and Young is does what it says on the tin, is there for people who have been bereaved and widowed under the age of 60, I want to say. So Ryder has got some amazing grief counselling support systems. They've also got lots of kind of online grief hubs that you can go to. Let's Talk About Loss is brilliant for 18 to 35-year-olds. I found Let's Talk About Loss after my dad died, and I've got some of my best friends who I met through there. They do sort of grief meetups in pubs and in parks, and it's much more accessible for people who are possibly navigating kind of early life without parents or without loved ones. Tommy's is there for families who are navigating baby loss and miscarriage, and Winston's Wish is brilliant if you are navigating conversations with children around bereavement as well. Carers UK, amazing for carers support, have a helpline as well as a huge amount of resource. Age UK, again, another helpline and lots of support on there as well. Alzheimer's Society has an online forum. So if you're looking after somebody, if somebody in your life has got Alzheimer's or dementia, they've got an amazing online forum where you can meet other people and share and have that peer support. And Marie Curie also have a huge amount of support and a helpline for people living with anticipatory grief. You can download the Get to Know Me document. We'll put a link in the comms follow up as well if you don't have your phones with you. I'm very open to connecting with people. I am all about kind of continuing this conversation in whatever way we can to make sure that people feel better equipped. We deliver training. We have compassionate leadership training, grief awareness training, carers support training, loads of different options that we can share with you as well. But yes, thanks so much for having me along, Lucy. I hope that today has been helpful, and I don't know what time it is, but hopefully we've got some time for some
No, we're
questions. Sorry.
good. No, that was more than amazing. I can see, there was so much chatter in the chat going through about the models that you shared, and lots of people asking for the resources, which is amazing. So I'm sure they would do another hour with you if they could. We've had some questions submitted through, and just as a reminder, we've got about 15 minutes left. So if there are any questions that folk want to submit, we've got a couple in the Q&A already, and I've got a couple as well that were submitted before the webinar too. So we'll get into those. But I think for me, it's just I can listen to you speak once a week, because I think there's just such a lovely way you put some of the models together with just this reminder that we don't need to overcomplicate things. And often it's these small little things that we can do, either just tweaking the way that we listen to people, or, that mirroring the language, I think was really, I'm a marketer. That's kind of what my background is. So we
Yeah.
talk about that every day. But then when it comes to these conversations that I'm maybe not as confident in, I forget that actually I can use some of those
Yeah.
tools to support me
I
there
know
too. So
it's such a weird thing in the grief space where we kind of feel like if we're not qualified to have the conversation, we just don't have it. And I think, we just rely on the idea of, okay, we'll signpost them to the EAP support, that maybe they'll have a bit more insight of how to support this person, or and some people need that additional signposting to professional clinical services, absolutely. But the majority of people need somebody to just feel comfortable sitting in that vulnerability with them. And like that is one of the real key things for me, is changing the way that we see our responsibility as a society in terms of being prepared to have these conversations. Because it's so, the conversations I can now have with my mum about grief and about her death, hopefully a long
Mm.
time away, but the fact that we've been able to do a lot of those conversations because we've kind of got this knowledge now, and we've got all the information that I've learned from working in this space, it's totally changed the dynamic of how we support each other. It's a really, it's just such an important topic, and I'm really, yeah, really glad that I was here, and it's really nice to see lots of lovely comments saying how
So
helpful it's been. I'm
many.
really pleased.
And yeah, any that we get a log of the comments. So Jenny, I can see you've asked Lucy to get in touch with you after about an opportunity. So we'll make sure we pick through and make sure everything's kind of passed to the right people afterwards as well. So
Of course,
do
yeah.
keep the chatter coming. But I think that idea of conversations and you feeling better for being able to do it is really important. And there's a couple of questions we've had around that. One around supporting employee. How do you support an employee who's clearly grieving but putting on a brave face?
Mm.
Someone may be suffering in silence and won't necessarily ask for help. And then there's kind of a follow up in our Q&A at the moment, but I'll kind of let you go
Yeah,
into
I
that.
mean, it's really challenging because I think you have to meet people where they are with the support they need in that moment. So that might change. So that person might be back at work, wanting that distraction, kind of bury their head in the sand, want to carry on, don't want to talk about it. But 6 months later, it might be a different conversation. I
Mm-hmm.
think the big thing is about being really open about that, and possibly just continuing that conversation, saying, I know it's been 3 months since you came back. And I know that, it seems like you're okay and it seems like you're coping okay, but I just want to keep that door open so that if there is any point that you might need that kind of additional support, then please let me know. I think, a big part of that is that psychological safety. Do people feel safe enough to show how
Mm-hmm.
it's impacting them at work? So it's about kind of building that relationship, and that won't happen overnight, especially if it's not part of your day-to-day practice now. This might feel like way too much but if you don't have that kind of intimate relationship with your colleagues or your team at the moment, it might be too much to kind of go in straight away with this, which is one of the reasons why we think that kind of visibility piece is so important. Quite often we'll work with organizations to introduce the ideas of this conversation happening in the workplace, for a year before we even do the line managers training, which allows people to then build on that relationship because at least the topic has been spoken about. So it is really challenging, but my best advice is to keep checking in. And if you're thinking about kind of enhancing your policies, one of the ways that you can do that is to say that bereavement leave can be taken at any point during that first year. So say you give people 2 weeks off and say this can be taken either as a chunk at the beginning or as in stages throughout the year, so that people feel like, okay, actually I want to come back to work after 5 days, but I know that I've got potentially 10 days that I can take at different points of the year if I need to, when those emotions might come up for me.
It's such a great point, and I think my husband and I on our morning walk this morning were actually talking about a similar thing about sometimes people just don't know what they can do, and
Mm.
you feel like you've communicated it, but I actually, until you've said it, would have never thought about the fact that I could take bereavement leave maybe for a relative that's passed away, but um, a few months later, for me and my very logical, very kind of probably slightly millennial brain is that, well, that relative passed then, so I need to take it kind of
Yeah.
in that chunk. So that's just, I guess, instantly gives a lot of flexibility.
Mm.
And
And a good example of that is when a lot of the time when people have or experience a miscarriage or baby loss, they quite often want to come back to work and kind of carry on
mm,
with life. But actually, that due date that might be, 6 months down the line is when that grief is really going to
yeah,
strike them. And so being aware of those sorts of things and almost being able to kind of put those not prevention tools, but being ready actively for those conversations, being able to offer that additional support ongoing is really important.
And I guess that's where things like the model of grief's just not a straight line and the
Mm,
get to know me kind of worksheets, they're never too late to do. So
yeah, absolutely.
that would be a really good tool for you. I guess the second part of that question as well is actually, you mentioned continuous conversations. So you led me on nicely to this one, which is if you are supporting a colleague with bereavement, doing those regular well-being check-ins, what point do you feel like it's okay to stop? Do you read the colleague from these check-ins to see if they're more comfortable, or do you just get to a certain point? I think this commenter said if the check-ins have been going on, say, 12 months, kind of how do you manage that ongoing communication?
I think again, it is a case of kind of so we're actually going to be next month releasing a resource, which is a return to work manager's guide for bereavement in particular. And it has a conversation guide about how regularly would you like me to check in? At what
Mm-hmm.
point do they move from those kind of well-being check-ins into back into kind of working one-to-one time? And I think, again, it's about following the lead of that person. They might want really regular check-ins for the first sort of 5, 6, 7 weeks, or longer. And it's about making sure that it meets their needs. So quite often when somebody's returning to work, we might say phase their workload back. So that can be a nice way to kind of, once they're back up to their full working capacity in terms of taking on the same level of tasks, that might be the time to phase out that well-being check-in. Or indeed, if somebody has kind of got ongoing well-being, well, if grief is impacting them in an ongoing way in those first few weeks and months, then I think, that kind of natural progression. I think the main thing there is about identifying when that person might need additional support, when actually like that peer support that you're able to offer them through that manager's relationship is actually not going far enough, and actually it's starting to turn into mental health and safeguarding
Mm,
concerns rather than just that kind of natural response to grief, at which point having all of the kind of EAP things that are available, but also being able to guide them and advise them to go to local GPs, or indeed, those additional grief resources like I shared at the end there. We've got loads more that we can probably link afterwards as well, just a kind of full grief resource hub in terms of different places that you can signpost people to. But I do think it is important to know that, sometimes, yeah, that conversation might be that actually that person needs a little bit more of clinical
mm-hmm.
support than just that peer support. And being able to identify that is important.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, which is a really good one, and I think will be relevant to a lot of folk here, which is if you're a smaller organization which isn't large enough to have internal networks, how is it best to connect with others to share experiences? I know you already shared a couple of ideas, but do you have anything else?
So probably my best recommendation is to do something around awareness days. So, Carers Week is in June, National Grief Awareness Week is in December, Baby Loss Week was in November. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but there's so many different campaigns throughout the year that you could invite people to come along,
Mm.
learn a little bit more about the topic. We quite often, when we work with small organizations, we'll do sort of like a 20, 30 minute presentation about a topic, and then we'll hold that space for people to reflect and share experiences, just so there's a bit of a safe space where networks possibly can't exist because we don't have enough people, but actually that space for those conversations can be really powerful, and hooking them into those awareness days can make them sometimes a bit more accessible, because people just think, okay, well, here's some information about the whole week that's going on this week. It's not an alien concept to me, but yeah, like lightly introducing those topics at work and being able to hold a little bit of reflection space is really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's such a good point, isn't it? It's just showing you're open to having those
Yeah.
conversations. And I think sometimes, again, with those small organizations, we're a small team too, but that's the team we're in. And, we love our team and they are supportive no matter how big or small they are. It might be that we don't have people going through the exact same thing as us, but they're the people that we have each day, kind of there to provide us with that support. I think that's kind of everything we've got time for today. I honestly, like I say, we could go on for hours. And I know Lucy and I are both talkers, so we probably genuinely left alone probably could. But thank you so, so much, Lucy. It was such a thoughtful, honest, and genuinely important session. And I know I'm speaking for kind of everyone when I say how much we appreciate you and sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us as well, and that care that really came through.
Thank
Lucy
you.
shares so much of that over on LinkedIn. We will encourage you all to connect. She is the loveliest, friendliest person. So please do that. We'll be sharing her info afterwards. Do keep in touch with her and all the wonderful work that Hospice UK do as well. And if you'd like to hear more about Strive and what we're doing, do get in touch too. My details will be here. I've just popped up a poll. So if you would like to learn more about our surveys, do make it known here and we can reach out to you directly afterwards. And a huge thank you to all of you for being here today. The questions, the engagement throughout have been so brilliant. It's really encouraging to see so many people in HR and leadership who are so committed to getting this right for people. And I think for me, it's just that thought of not overcomplicating it and treating it like a really human experience. So thank you all. Lucy, I will catch up with you after when this webinar ends. It does just end quite quickly. So I will bid you adieu and thank you so much. And thank you again to our audience. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day and we'll see you very soon at the next webinar. Bye, everyone.